Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The two, the biggest lie is where this war came from. And I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the U.S. rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. You get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts. But we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh, yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO. And the Iraq War was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally, Assad, with the CIA regime change operation. And oh, yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border. And not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the U.S. Conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the U.S. government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then. It started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the U.S. poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Newland, have been part of this story since 2014 and really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Newland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the U.S. pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Newland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the U.S. government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that, said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliances? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of Nato himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game? It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, and they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me. But the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
We now have a lot of more aggressive cross-border incursions by allied Ukrainian forces into Russia, along with Biden reversing himself yet again and saying he would send F-16 fighter jets after refusing. How do you assess the actual danger of escalation in terms of the possibility of some direct U.S.-Russia military conflict, even as an episodic misperception, and ultimately the longer-term risks of things like all-out war between the West and Russia?
Well, the risks are extremely high because we have a very determined Biden administration that wants to keep escalating. Russia is absolutely determined to prevent NATO from enlarging to Ukraine for understandable reasons, in my view. It's a 1,900-kilometer border of Ukraine, and Russia does not want the U.S. military alliance on its border. And so as long as the Biden administration and the media that are absolutely supporting it and disguising the basic facts continue to push this NATO enlargement, we're going to have an escalating war. This war was completely avoidable. The party in this conflict that actually sought diplomacy repeatedly was Russia. Not something you'd read in the New York Times, actually, but the fact. And it was Russia that put on the table on December 17th, 2021, a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to forestall the war. I actually called the White House. Soon afterwards, I said, you've got the basis to negotiate. Avoid this war. And I was told, no, we're not going to discuss NATO enlargement. That's our business. It's not Russia's business. And I said, are you kidding? This is going to cause a massive and very dangerous war. No, this is our policy and so forth. You could ask the question, if they did a little thought experiment, how would the Biden administration think about Russia establishing military bases in Mexico? Probably not thrilled. They probably wouldn't say, well, that's Mexico's choice. What are we going to do about it? So a little bit of thinking and empathy might have gone a long way. But we have heard almost nothing about it in your expertise, which I'm just amazed at day by day how the New York Times and other mainstream media twist all of this. I recently asked an assistant of mine, please do a scan for the last 2 years of the editorial pages of the New York Times. 26 times the idea of unprovoked invasion has been raised by the New York Times in its editorials, in its opinion columns of the New York Times columnists like Tom Friedman and others, and in the invited op-eds. And you just can't get a word in otherwise. You can't tell that readership you were just describing in Manhattan, where I happen to live, what's really going on. So this is the frightening part. And we're also told, Glenn, which is pretty damn weird, don't worry about nuclear escalation. Don't be blackmailed by this. My advice is worry and worry a lot. And if you have been around these issues for a while, and I have for decades, and I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful quest to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, if you're not worried, you just don't get it, because you better be worried. And I'm very worried about this administration not getting it.
It was such a staple of Cold War culture, Cold War policy, that avoiding nuclear war was the single greatest priority as we were going around the world with these proxy conflicts against the Soviet Union. We managed never to directly engage them militarily. And even then, misperception, miscommunication did bring the world close to nuclear annihilation, at least on 2 occasions, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And yet it really does amaze me that we seem to have just kind of through, inertia or lethargy or historical ignorance, come to view the risk of nuclear war as basically a fiction, as kind of assigning zero value to it, or even this kind of macho attitude that we're not going to be deterred by a country having nuclear weapons. Talk a little bit about, in the time that you've been working in all the things that I discussed in these kind of geopolitical framework, even from an economics perspective, the specter of nuclear war and how it used to be kind of important for people and policymakers in deciding what they would and wouldn't do.
There was one moment when Biden was caught on tape saying, we're on a path to Armageddon. This is, I think it was the fall of 2021, if I remember.
No, 2022.
2022.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
I'm sorry, 2022. Excuse me. And he was excoriated by the press the next day, rather than anybody reflecting. Oh my God, the president of the United States is saying this. He was excoriated. How dare he say this? He let a tiny glimmer of the truth in. And then, of course, the whole idea was shut that up. Don't talk about that. Well, anyone that knows some history, and by the way, if you want to know some history, the most wonderful book written about this by a great historian is a book called Gambling with Armageddon by a late great historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole atomic age, in fact. And the book is terrifying because we came so close 60 years ago, actually 61 years ago now, to nuclear annihilation. And almost every one of Kennedy's aides would have pushed us to that. We fortunately had a president who had the sense to avoid the ultimate disaster, but almost none of his aides had that sense. And what Sherwin recalls and what we've learned from Dan Ellsberg and from so many others is how close we've come and how easy it is to come close because there's so many stupid people in our government. Believe me, this is something I can tell you absolutely. People who don't think, who are extraordinarily lacking in basic common sense, who believe that power is the only coin of the realm, who believe you really do have to be tough on whatever it is, and nuclear war will see them down. And all of this is extraordinarily reckless, and we're really in it now. And it's, of course, not just Ukraine. It's Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan. It's us doing whatever we can to humiliate China. It's having an absurd G7 meeting last week in Hiroshima, of all places, that the U.S., of course, bombed with the first nuclear atomic bomb, spending the whole G7, in essence, to attack China and Russia. They think it plays politics. They think it's a game. It's extraordinarily reckless and extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily predictable what's going on.
Yeah.
Because the real diplomats inside the U.S. have been warning about this for decades. We're only finding some of it out by WikiLeaks and by disclosures such as Bill Burns, their CIA director, who was in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he sent a memo that everybody should read.
To Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbigniew Brzezinski that I didn't remember, writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out basically to the year the sequence of how it's going to be the first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way, apparently, to get her out of the government.
except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008 when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. And that's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of The New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing to be the New Yorker of all places. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, you know, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, you know, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace, and I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO, and Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now who tells me that in the archives he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse.
Right.
Even and in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. We do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. The reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between 2 giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, so though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Newland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev. And I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow. And it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014, and it started with the U.S. participation in a coup.
What is the path to peace for the war in Ukraine? Is America still powerful enough to impose global order? The US has just 4.1% of the world's population, while BRICS countries have 41.5%. In this conversation with economist Jeffrey Sachs, we discuss the origins of the conflict in Ukraine and NATO enlargement, US-China relations, and the decline of US dominance. Jeffrey Sachs is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Sachs has been special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General. He was an economic advisor to Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and former president of the Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. Sachs was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and received the Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, the Legion of Honor from France, and was co-recipient of the Blue Planet Prize. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome back to One Planet Podcast and the Creative Process.
Thank you for having me.
So help us understand the history of the war in Ukraine. How did we get here and how do we get out of it? And if the United States isn't the country to help broker that peace, what country is?
This conflict is actually decades in the making. It didn't just come out of a Russian invasion in 2022, as is often said in the Western mainstream media. The war is often defined as an unprovoked attack in 2022. Actually, the roots of this war go back to the end of the Soviet Union and to the geopolitics around that. In 1990, the U.S. and Germany promised the Soviet government at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if Gorbachev went ahead and disbanded the Soviet military alliance. In other words, there would be a deal that on the Soviet side, the military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, would be ended, and on the Western side, NATO would not take advantage, and Germany would be reunified, but NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. The U.S. cheated on that because as soon as the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the policymakers in Washington, especially in the Pentagon and in the permanent state in the United States, immediately planned for the eastern expansion of NATO. And by 1992, Ukraine was already on the list that NATO would go that far. In fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a U.S. major geostrategist, wrote in 1997 the timeline for NATO expansion, including that Ukraine would become candidate between 2005 and 2010, which is exactly what happened. So this war started, in my opinion, because the United States could not accept a peace in which the military alliances of both sides of the Cold War would stand down. Well, many things happened over the 30 years between the early 1990s and today, but probably the highlights to mention are that in 2008, George W. Bush Jr. forced NATO, pushed NATO, but really pressed that NATO would announce that Ukraine would become a member. And that happened at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. The Russian leadership was furious. They had warned again and again, don't do that. We don't want your military right up against our 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Then a Ukrainian president won the election in 2010 on the program of neutrality for Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych won the election based on the idea that Ukraine doesn't want to become the battlefield between two superpowers, and called for neutrality, which had been enshrined in the original Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, but then was abandoned by some of the NATO-oriented politicians of Ukraine later on. So in 2010, Yanukovych called for neutrality, but he was overthrown violently in early 2014 with the U.S. participation. So this was really a terrible escalation, because the relatively pro-Russian president, but one who called for neutrality, which I think was the only safe course for Ukraine, was overthrown, and the United States played a significant role in that. People know about the famous tape of Victoria Nuland, who is now our Undersecretary of State. At the time, she was the Assistant Secretary of State, and she described who the U.S. would see as the next government 3 weeks before a violent overthrow. It's pretty ugly business, in my opinion. Well, in any event, the war started in February 2014. It escalated between 2014 and 2021. The attempt to end the fighting at the end of 2014 and early 2015 came in two agreements called the Minsk Agreements, in which the government of Ukraine agreed with the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine that those regions would gain autonomy. And then the government of Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk II agreements, even though they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. So the diplomacy failed again. And when Biden came into office in 2021, rather than trying to de-escalate, he called for NATO enlargement and reinforced the U.S. push to expand eastward. Putin strongly pushed back. Biden pushed back. The U.S. signed several statements in 2021 confirming that NATO would enlarge. I think this was all absolutely irresponsible. Russia massed troops on its border and put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement on December 17th, 2021, based on no NATO enlargement. The Biden administration formally replied that it was not willing to negotiate over that issue in a response in January. Then Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022, making clear that it was the failure to reach an understanding on the NATO question that was central to Russia's action. 4 weeks later, Zelensky declared that Ukraine was accepting of neutrality. In other words, the initial Russian invasion brought Ukraine to the negotiating table. And during the second half of March, with the Turkish government being the mediators, Russia and Ukraine hammered out a peace agreement. Incredibly, the United States blocked it, because the United States told the Ukrainian government, you fight on, because American policymakers had two ideas. One was that Ukraine should not be neutral, it should be a NATO country. And second, that the war would be won by some combination of Western armaments and financial sanctions. And so the U.S. ratcheted up the war. Putin said, no, we don't stand down, we fight, and mobilized hundreds of thousands of Russians in the summer of 2022. And since then, we've been on a path of military escalation. I resent the fact, as a citizen threatened by this, that Biden has not negotiated over NATO, and that Biden and Putin have not talked once, as far as we know, since February 24th, 2022. You know, when two sides are fighting, they need to talk and negotiate. But that's rejected. The hardliners in the United States, Newland, Blinken, Sullivan, Biden, say, why negotiate? We just escalate. We'll defeat Russia. This is, in my view, utterly reckless and irresponsible. First, it leads to the destruction of Ukraine. And second, it risks the escalation to nuclear war. So I'm very unhappy about this, and I very much resent that the mainstream media, like the New York Times, repeats the falsehood all the time that this was an unprovoked action on February 24th, 2022, seemingly wanting us to be without any context or history to understand where this conflict came from and how it can end. And a newspaper like the New York Times has a responsibility to tell the truth, and they're not doing it.
Indeed, as citizens, we have the right. A country is not looking after, in the US, the prosperity of its own citizens, going out, conducting these irresponsible wars when we don't have time with other things with the environment. Ironically, what seems to be behind it all is this insistence on a unipolar world, insistence on dominance. And while the US wants to hold on to its status as a reserve currency, it seems under those economic sanctions that US has also suffered, it might even be hastening, strengthening the currencies of other countries.
Well, the basic point is the U.S. has 4.1% of the world population, so how could it presume to be the world leader? The U.S. is a powerful country, it's a rich country, but it doesn't run the world, and it should not aspire to run the world. That's a kind of madness. And the U.S. ideology for a long time has been that the U.S. should run the world. It's, to my mind, unbelievable. But then again, I've spent most of my career outside the U.S. seeing the other 95.9% of the world. And I know that the other 95% of the world doesn't want the United States to run the world. It's not against the United States. It just says, let us have our own part of the world. We don't want you running the world. We don't want you deciding what our government is, who we are, how we rule ourselves. You're just one place. And this, the United States leaders don't understand. They're very arrogant. They're very ignorant because of the two big oceans. They're very unaware of the history of other parts of the world. And we end up with this arrogant and naive and dangerous foreign policy because there's no doubt the United States is rich and powerful, and it makes lots of weapon systems. And I'm 68 years old, and the United States has been at war almost every year of my life, from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Nicaragua and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. Come on, give it a break. And the U.S. is also experiencing the reality that other places in the world are catching up on technology, indeed leading on technologies as well. And China's a very successful, very industrious, very hardworking society, which in the last 40 years has gone from poverty to a very significant world important economy. And the U.S. has a very hard time accepting that. The U.S. attitude, if you listen to congressmen who don't seem to know anything, is, if China's successful, it must be because they're cheating. What about because they're saving more than 40% of GDP, that the Chinese people have been engaging in a remarkable upgrading of education, hundreds of thousands of PhDs minted each year, massive scientific research programs. Come on, this is the truth. And so this arrogance is not allowing the truth to come through. But you mentioned one specific point, which is the role of the US dollar. Part of the US strength after World War II is, the US was basically the only economy standing, and it was a technologically advanced, rich, large economy, the world's largest. And the dollar was really the only internationally usable currency for quite a long time. So the dollar system became the center of how you do international trade. When you trade in goods, they're denominated in dollars. When you buy the imports, you pay in dollars, meaning you use accounts in US dollars, typically in the US banking system. When the transaction is closed, it's closed through the so-called SWIFT interbank system. And so the U.S. has had what France long ago called an exorbitant privilege, that it could print a lot of money because the rest of the world was holding dollars, using dollars. The dollar was the basis of the world economy. That's changing now. And it's changing for three basic reasons. One is the share of the U.S. in the world economy is diminishing. So this means that the predominance of the U.S. is bound to diminish. The second is technologically, settlements are going to occur in all sorts of ways other than through U.S. banks. And so-called digital currencies, especially central bank digital currencies, will mean other ways to make settlements. We'll settle in renminbi when we buy in China, or settle in rubles, or settle in rupees when trade is with India, and so forth. So there will be multiple currencies. And then the third part, which is really a matter of a bad set of decision making, the U.S. has militarized the dollar, meaning that usually you think about money, well, you have it, you can use it, you can spend it. But the United States has come to say, if we don't like you, you don't necessarily have access to your money anymore if it's in our banks. So the U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Russia. The U.S. has frozen the dollar holdings of Venezuela. The U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Afghanistan. My advice to any government that's not getting along with the U.S. government is be careful about your money, because the U.S. might come in and freeze your money. And so countries are looking to hold their reserves in other ways now. Perfectly understandable. And I think that this is another part of the move to a multi-currency international system from a dollar-based international system.
And you mentioned the possibility of a reserve currency being the renminbi. And so there's other things that are not often reported about China. One, and I know that you've written about this as well, is that they're stepping in where America's policy of destabilizing and it's destructive. China, in some cases in the Middle East, is stepping in as a peacemaker, and it's less expensive if we can achieve peace.
Well, probably the most remarkable diplomatic achievement of recent years, I would say, is China brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In the American idea, those two countries were implacable foes. They could never agree. And for the United States, Iran was the enemy and Saudi Arabia was the ally. But the whole idea of U.S. foreign policy is you bring countries under your authority as an ally of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, and you fight your enemies on the other side. But China has a different idea, which is that Saudi Arabia and Iran had no fundamental reasons for this dissension, but they have plenty of reasons for cooperation. For one thing, they're both being hard hit by climate change. They need to cooperate because the water crisis is quite severe. They're both hydrocarbon economies. They need an energy transformation, which is very profound. And so the Chinese facilitated a reconciliation between the two. I'm very happy about that reconciliation, by the way. The fighting between, the bitterness between Iran and Saudi Arabia divided Western Asia. It contributed to an absolutely devastating war in Yemen, in which the United States gave its military support that killed a lot of people. And it destabilized a region that needs a lot of economic transformation and technological upgrading and change. And so this agreement is really a big help for the whole region, not only for the two countries involved. And China gets a lot of credit, in my view, for having the wisdom to see that that was a conflict that could be solved, not just exacerbated. But the U.S. approach was always to push at it. Even when the U.S. made an agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement called the JCPOA, the U.S. government walked away from it. And then it maintained sanctions on Iran because the U.S. is not really serious at making peace most of the time. It's got an us versus them mentality. And I find that very destructive and not in the U.S. interest.
Yes. And I hope that China maintains this sensible approach, because it's dangerous what's happening now in Taiwan. And just help us understand the situation, like in that through line between these proxy wars and what could happen in China.
Well, the situation in Taiwan is like the situation in Ukraine, very explosive, very dangerous, and requires cool heads to avoid a conflict. The fact of the matter is that actually all three governments, let me say, the United States, Taiwan, and China, have a policy that there's one China. And whether it is the government in Taiwan or the government in Beijing, they both say there's one China. They disagree on what happened in 1949 and how China should be governed, but they don't say there are two countries. And the United States, when it established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, very clearly said that there is one China and has one China policy. And that is how to keep peace and to make sure that this tension between Beijing and Taipei does not boil over to open conflict. But the United States started to play games with this. It started to form a military alliance with Taiwan, in effect, which is really coming into a military alliance in the middle of one country. And this is an extremely dangerous and imprudent thing to do. And Biden starts talking about how we're going to defend Taiwan, and the American politicians talk about how a war is coming. It's all utterly reckless, irresponsible. And what we should have is trying to reduce tensions, diffuse tensions through negotiation, through talk, through peace-building ideas, rather than stoking the idea that some conflict is inevitable. A conflict would be devastating, of course, first and foremost for Taiwan, but actually for the whole world. And so this needs to be avoided, and we need cool heads, and we shouldn't have American politicians saber-rattling. We should not have Speaker Nancy Pelosi fly to Taiwan after the Chinese government has repeatedly said, don't do that, don't provoke, don't stir up things. Don't make conflicts where there don't have to be conflicts. But the United States leadership doesn't listen very well. It's the same thing that when Putin said many, many, many times, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. The United States, oh, sorry, we don't hear you. You have nothing to say about that. That's none of your business. And then war comes. This is very typical of American foreign policy because American foreign policy leaders are too arrogant and they don't listen.
Yes. And now, 61 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'd think we learned our lesson. And of course, America would never accept a military alliance on its doorstep, say coming down from Canada or something like that.
Well, of course, when Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in 1960, the U.S. idea was invade. That's it. It didn't say, oh, Mr. Castro, you can do what you want. It's an open door. If you want to be with Soviet Union, that's fine with us. No, it said, well, we invade. So that was 1961. In 1962, in the repercussions of that and in a really reckless gamble and reckless action by the Soviet Union putting missiles into Cuba, this whole conflict escalated to just the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in 1963, both President Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev said, we have to pull back from the brink. We have to live together. We should not be coming to the edge of global nuclear war. And they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963, proving that even at the height of the Cold War, if the mindset is right, you can make peace. And that's the mindset that we need now.
Yes, it seems like the neocon mindset never really went away. Just help us understand, because to my mind, Ukraine is not indispensable for the U.S., right? It's just this idea of NATO enlargement. But there's other forces behind the scenes that are, profiting or pushing. And I understand that Zelensky, secured $110 billion in U.S. aid and, of course, humanitarian, financial, military support. Also, like key partnerships with, the BlackRock venture capital firm, Goldman Sachs, to privatize Ukrainian assets. So that would then deepen the country's debt. So help us understand that a little, the path forward. How do we get out of this?
Well, when the debate raged initially in the 1990s about the wisdom or lack of wisdom of NATO enlargement, which was contrary to what we had promised and was not wise, a lobbying campaign took place in the United States led by the military-industrial complex. Very crude. That's how American politics works. Bring out the big bucks. So it was Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and other big companies became the lobbyists. And then, American congressmen, they salute money. They salute campaign contributions. They salute the lobbyists. And so this is how American politics works. There are always financial interests that are also playing a role here. So we have a mix of ideology, confusion, lack of historical sense, arrogance, and money all stirring the pot. It has very little to do with the American people, though. The American people are not asked about anything. The votes on money for Ukraine are generally almost secret because they're not really debated. They're just measures stuck into some other piece of legislation so that you never have to debate the fact that we've spent more than $110 billion so far on Ukraine, and nobody's really been asked about it. Nothing of the American people haven't really been asked. So this is how American politics works. Now, what should be done? This war should end by the United States saying that NATO will not enlarge and Russia saying we take our troops home. That's the core of this. That was available in December 2021. It was available in March 2022, and it's still available now. It doesn't solve many, many other issues. What happens to the territories? What happens to Crimea? These are for negotiations, but the basic idea is that the two superpowers back off and that the war stops and that we go to political solutions, not military solutions. And that should be our priority.
And so finally, as you think about the future, the prospect of nuclear war, the kind of world that we're leaving the next generation, what would you like young people to know, preserve, and remember?
Young people should lead the way to a safer, cooperative, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable and fair world. This is the point. We need to build the future we want, not to feel trapped in this mindless cycle of violence and environmental destruction. The problems that we face are solvable, and they are not driven by the needs of the people. They're driven by greed or power seeking of elites. And we need to have a new generation say, this is not working. We want a world that is at peace, that is shared in prosperity, and that solves the environmental crises, which have become so deep and are neglected in part because we are wasting our time, our lives, our resources on these useless wars.
Let me say that even aside from conflict zones, we have a more basic problem, which is that education requires financing, and poor countries just don't have the finance on their own to be able to provide an education for all of the children. And so the result is conflict, no conflict, AI, no AI. We've got hundreds of millions of kids out of school, and even those that are in school are in under-resourced schools so that they're not learning very much. And this is a phenomenal crisis. Education should not just be for the elite. Education is so fundamental for human well-being, so fundamental for economic development, so fundamental for the basic functioning of society, that we have to ensure truly, not only as a slogan, but truly, that every child is in school and every child is learning. We're not doing that. AI should be able to help us to do that, because now with online education and with AI tools, we can reach more children at lower cost. But the truth is that any effort of education requires a lot of social organization, a lot of government determination, and a lot of financing. And in general, we have not lived up to this challenge. The rich countries just haven't cared about education in the poor countries. This is the basic sad fact of our world.
It is indeed a very sad fact. So I would like to touch upon three things. First, let's dive deeper into technology. What are the challenges in implementing technology-based education solutions in conflict zone? And how can we ensure these solutions are sustainable and adaptable for the long term?
I'm going to continue to emphasize that conflict zones, of course, make everything worse. But even without conflicts, we are not solving basic education issues. The main obstacle is poverty, and even in countries that aren't poor, inequality, where the rich just don't care enough to pay taxes or to enable the government to extend education to everybody. So there are many reasons why we're not living up to what we need. Extreme poverty, for me, is heartbreaking and obvious. Conflicts are devastating because usually they could be ended if we really tried in a just way to end them quickly. And within societies, there's a lot of injustice. Minority groups don't get to go to school, or the rich don't want to pay taxes to help the poor. So there are many, many obstacles. And again, if you think about it from the point of view of an individual child, a child without an education today has no future. This is a sad reality. What kind of job is there in this world without education? Nothing but backbreaking labor or some terrible life that we don't wish for any child. When it comes to using technology to overcome these problems, all of the same issues that have been barriers for normal education remain. For example, in many poor countries, there aren't schools. Or if there are schools, there's no electricity in the schools. Or if there is some electricity once in a while in the schools, there's no connectivity for devices. Or if there is connectivity, if there's a base station someplace, there are no computers. Or the kids don't have devices. So to say that education is going to solve it, the technology is going to solve it, is basically to say, yes, we will systematically close all the gaps right now. And that's true whether we're doing it with technology or whether we're doing it with a teacher in a classroom that has a solar panel on the roof and is providing education for the children. Either way, we have to have an organized approach that starts from the premise that it's unacceptable for children to be out of school.
So let's then touch on this organized approach. So in practical terms, what global policy shifts would you recommend? Oh, can everyone hear us? Yeah. In practical terms, what global policy shifts would you recommend to ensure education remains a priority in conflicts, in time of conflict, and in times of no conflict?
The first thing I would do is I would like to educate our leaders, to tell them that they don't do their job, because our governments are so good at war, but they're terrible at peace. I'm going to start with my own country. It spends $1 trillion on the military. It's engaged in wars all over the world. And when it comes to children's education abroad in poor countries, you'll have half our Congress saying, why should we waste our money on other people? You know, they want to spend $1 trillion on wars, but the idea that they would spend it on children is something that they don't understand. So the first thing I'd like to do is educate our leaders why this is so fundamental, and just to be decent people. That's maybe the first point. But then the problem is, and I'm in this business, if I could put it this way, for 40 years I deal with finance ministers. If I say to a finance minister, Mr. Minister, education's really important in your country. You really should make sure there's a budget. He'll look at me like I'm crazy. Are you ignorant, Mr. Sachs? Do you think I could afford to have all the children in school? And we would go through the numbers. And when we go through the numbers, we would find that education is beyond his budgetary means. Now, here's an interesting issue. That finance minister will go to Washington because poor country. He'll go to the International Monetary Fund. Do you think when he goes to the International Monetary Fund that anyone there will say to him, Mr. Minister, we really want to help you make sure that all your children are in school? He'll never hear that. I'm sorry. He'll never hear that. What he'll hear is balance your budget, keep your spending down, don't have inflation. But the idea that somebody should help this minister of a poor country to find the resources to have all the children in school, that will be the revolution that comes that will change the world to make the world decent. Because when a finance minister goes to the IMF, the first thing the IMF should say is, Mr. Minister, let's have a seat. Are your kids in school? No. Oh, we've got to do something about that. Do you have health care? No. Oh, well, we've got to do something about that. Do you have electricity for all? No. Oh, but that's SDG 7. We've got to do something about that. That's the revolution that we need, that somebody cares. The reason that they don't care, by the way, is that if you expose the financing gap, then somebody has to fill it. And then they'll turn to the United States and say, oh, you're a big, rich country. Why don't you help fill it? And the United States will say, why should we help fill it? We don't care. And that's the problem. And so this is where we're stuck in this world. We can't yet get an agreement to be decent. We have many goals. We've set all these objectives. We have all these processes, but we don't get to the bottom line, which is that in order to enable people in poor countries or in crisis zones to function, we have to solve problems. When it comes to poverty, we have to help provide finance. When it comes to conflict zones, we have to stop the wars. So these are the 2 points that are critical.
So is it fair if I summarize it as we need to educate the policymakers and we need to make sure that they care more?
This is a problem that philosophers have worried about for about 2,300 years, because Plato asked the question, how do we get decent leaders? And he wrote a book about it 2,300 years ago called The Republic. And the idea was he tried to figure out, he was the greatest philosopher of his age, he tried to figure out what should we do? And he said, well, we have to raise the people who are going to be the leaders in an appropriate way so that they have good values, so that they have virtues, and they can't own any property, said Plato. They have to live decently, but they can't own any individual property, otherwise they'll be corrupted. So this is something that he already worried about more than 2 millennia ago. But to be serious for us today, most people want to do the right things. Most people in the world want sustainable development and a decent life for all children, not only for their own children. But many leaders, unfortunately in my country, many leaders think that their job is to make themselves rich or to make their country rich and not to worry about the rest of the world. And that really is our biggest challenge right now.
I hear you, and I think we hear you all very clearly. Let us talk now about different mechanisms, financing mechanisms.
Sure.
So what are some of sustainable education finance mechanisms in area expert, like in conflict zone and beyond conflict zones? And more, I would say, more globally in the global south, how can these funding models balance the immediate needs of education and making sure that there is reconstructions and rebuilding?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with spreadsheets, meaning I look at how much things cost and what the budget should be. And there are 2 points that I want to emphasize about the budget of education in a low-income country. In a poor country, typically the population is a very young age. Usually there's a high fertility rate and rapid population growth and a lot of children. So you have a lot of children that need to be in school relative to the size of the population. That's the first issue. That's why it's expensive. Second, there are very few qualified teachers, and their salaries are much higher than the average salary. So if you look at the cost of education, not in an absolute number, like number of dollars, but in relative to the average wage in the population, it's rather expensive in a low-income country. So the budgetary outlays that you need are usually well beyond 10% of national income. And that's usually more than half the total budget, which is why it's unaffordable. So we need a way to make education affordable, even in those places. Here's the good news. Think of educating a child just from a purely financial point of view, that you pay for the teachers and the schools, you put the child through 12 years of primary and secondary education, you enable the child to go to maybe 3 or 4 years of tertiary education. Think of that as an investment, and then ask, what is the return to that investment? Well, if you compare the child that leaves school after 6 years with the child that gets a university education, say, if you look at the salary gain for that child, which is a kind of measure of the productivity gain of that child, the return is phenomenal. It's a great investment. It's about 20% rate of return. So, boy, you want to do that. Now, the child's family can't say, no problem, I'll go to the bank and I'll borrow and I'll invest in my child, because they're poor. Their bank can't do it. Their government can't do it. But if we could get financing to that government at decent terms, say 3 or 4% interest rate, and on a 40-year loan, I would say to the government, borrow to ensure that all the children are in school, because later on you'll be a much richer economy and you'll be able to pay back that loan. So what I've been advocating for 20 years is that we increase the amount of official financing so that governments have the means to carry out what they need to carry out. And this is quite feasible in education, because the returns to education, financial returns, not just human returns, but financial returns, are very high. But 40 years it takes to get the returns, because you have to educate the child, they have to go to the labor market, they have to earn a higher income, then it pays off. And so what happens if a government goes and borrows a 7-year loan like they're told to do? Well, when that loan is due in 7 years, the child's in 8th grade. There's no return yet. And so the government goes bankrupt before the return actually occurs. So we need long-term, high-quality financing. And then when we have that, then all the questions that you are seeking about and answers about artificial intelligence, digital connectivity, and so on, all become possible. Because then when the money's there, a creative education minister could say, oh, I'm going to get all the schools online. I'm going to have a master class so that all the students can learn calculus, because we have a great teacher in the capital, but not in the provinces. But we'll have the connected classroom. So many things could be done, but you need the resources to do them.
So on that note, just last September, from your segment from Educate a Child lecture series, you said, and I'm quoting you, educating a child in dollar and cents term offers the highest return in terms of skills. That's what you just discussed. Labor productivity and societal investment. This requires a 20-year investment and then in 20-year the return. We need at least $50 billion a year for SDG 4. We need connectivity, we need devices, water, electricity, hardware, local languages, and a budget. We need Apple, Google, Reliance, and others to contribute. No more pilot project. And Dr. Sachs, I couldn't agree more. We need to do this at scale. UNESCO, UNICEF, Global Partnership for Education, UNCHR, and other organizations need to lead with a call for a reality. The reality is every child needs to be in school. That's what we pledge, and it's the only thing that makes sense. And in the code. So my question, Dr. Sachs, can the Global Health Fund be replicated for education? And why has that not happened yet? Because I know that you have been advocating for a similar fund. Why are we not able to bring in an education global fund?
Well, 23 years ago, Kofi Annan and Dr. Gru Brundtland asked me to help set up a special fund for health, which became the global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And I remember writing out the plans for that and advocating not $50 billion a year at the time, but about $5 billion a year, saying this will save a lot of lives. And there were so many naysayers. Oh, you can't do this. The money will be wasted. It will be stolen. People don't know how to take their medicines. Every excuse possible was given. But Kofi Annan was a great, great man. And Dr. Brundtland is one of the greatest statespersons of our age. And they made it happen. And that global fund has saved tens of millions of lives because it really worked. Now, it's a puzzle to me. When it started to work, I went around, I said, I told you so. I said to the governments, I told you this would work. There are many skilled people around. They want to make it work. You should do the same thing with education. No response. And so it has been a mystery to me why health got some attention, though, when it comes to health, rich people say, oh, maybe we better help poor people because otherwise we'll catch it. Maybe there's a little bit of self-interest there. I don't really have a full explanation, but what I would say to world leaders, what I do say every day is we can't afford a planet in which the children are not in school. There is no greater investment. Literally, it's not just a slogan. It's not just morals. Try to run a society with uneducated people. Try it. It doesn't work. Your society will fall to pieces. You won't have jobs. You won't have investment. You won't have infrastructure. You won't have peace. And so we've got to do this. $50 billion a year may seem like a big number. It's actually not a big number at all. I like to remind people the world economy, that is what is produced in a year, is $100 trillion. $100 trillion. So that means that $100 billion is 0.1% of output. Now, I would ask the people listening, could the world afford 0.1% of the output to make sure that every child is in school? I think the question answers itself. What could be more obvious? And yet, come to Washington, you'll meet a lot of really, I won't use the word, but anyway, come to Washington and you'll meet a lot of interesting people, I'll use that adjective, who won't understand why to spend 0.1% of world output for children, and then we can go figure out what's wrong with this world.
Dr. Sachs, as an ex-Washingtonian, I'm actually very pleased
thank
that
you.
call them out on this podcast. But can I say something?
Yes.
I don't know I couldn't figure out that puzzle. Is it because health is big pharma and education is not as lucrative?
That's such an interesting and good idea. This is part of it for sure. Although I wouldn't say Big Pharma was the biggest champion of things at the beginning, but the fact that there were companies around probably said, yes, we could get those products from, and I remember I was in those discussions telling those companies, you have to sell your product at cost, not at 100 times markup. But the fact that there were the companies there made a difference. But we've got big tech companies. So these big tech companies they're so rich. We can't even imagine how rich they are. So Google or...
big companies don't take risk in poorer countries because the risk is higher.
I don't want them to take risk. I want them to do their job.
Of investments. Yeah, I hear you.
I want them to do their job. Their human job. Google wants to organize knowledge on this world. Okay, education's part of that. I would say to Google, I know the leaders of Google. Come on, choose a couple countries, show you operate at scale. Show you can get every kid in school in a couple of years. They could do it.
And yet it's not happening.
It's not quite happening yet. Don't give up. You got to keep pushing, because suddenly the door opens and you walk through it.
Okay, well, you hear Dr. Sachs, let's continue being hopeful. It is really difficult at times to be hopeful. But yeah, absolutely. So I don't want us to...
I think the world's changing in a better way, actually. I really do. I mean that seriously, not just to cheer people up, but the world's changing. One of the things that's happening is, here we are in Doha in this wonderful conference. Okay, that's a wonderful thing. You know, it's not in Washington, by the way. They can't figure out how to have it in Washington, but we have it here. The world is becoming much, much more multipolar. It doesn't depend on London or Washington anymore. God forbid. Now there's so many more places where people can do things, take leadership, make action. And this is the most hopeful point, that we're not depending on a couple of places, couple of greedy places. We're depending on our own will and activity in a world that has much, much more capacity all over the world.
I concur, whether we would like to recognize it or not, but the world order is changing.
Absolutely. And I think all for the good, by the way. That's my feeling.
So let us just two concluding thoughts. Reflecting on your extensive experience in the intersection of policy, education, and innovation, what gives you hope about the future of education?
What gives me hope is that we have so many wonderful ways to learn and to teach right now. And I get online in the morning and I'm able to give classes all over the world. This was something unimaginable a few years ago. We have our students connected to students all over the world for free on Zoom in a wonderful way. We have knowledge at our fingertips like never before. My God, if we want to pursue education and knowledge and cultural appreciation and co-learning with people in different parts of the world, we can do things that were unimaginable just a few years ago.
Absolutely. And then finally, what message would you like to convey to global leaders? And I would like you here to be as vocal as possible, not only because this is a podcast that we're hoping that will be heard by many, but also because I know that there are a few leaders representing their countries with us today. What would be your message to them and to policymakers about the role of education in shaping a more resilient and, for God's sake, equitable world?
A week ago, I was invited to speak to the UN Security Council, and I really cherished the opportunity, and I told them that every one of these wars right now could end immediately, even within the UN Security Council, if they did their job properly. Yeah. Today, we could have a state of Palestine announced and become a member of the United Nations. Today. That's been in every resolution. Why don't they vote it today? Why doesn't the United States stop blocking something like that? Why don't we get real solutions to each of these wars? The war in Ukraine would stop today if NATO agreed to stop trying to expand to Ukraine, because that's why we have a war in Ukraine. Today, I would like to stop all the wars. And tomorrow, I would like to use the savings and get the kids in school. It's as simple as that.